And coming up in our guest segments in our Canucks and Cup feature, Brigham, Quebec's Andrew Ossowski, who works in the engine shop at Hendrick. With their mini rash of engine woes, it is a timely technical tutorial.
Hi, this is Robbie Gordon. We're coming right back on Raceline Radio.
This is the Raceline Radio Network. I'm Eric Thomas. Thrilled to pieces you're with us. Resurrecting now a long-running feature we call Canucks in Cup. We'll be locked in with Canadians who have moved south to work in the NASCAR Sprint Cup Series in roles other than driving, and yeah, there are a lot of them. In this installment, we meet Andrew Ossowski of Brigham, Quebec, who has worked at Hendrick Motorsports for 12 years now, assembling engines in the engine shop for the immediate Hendrick quartet of Jimmy Johnson, Jeff Gordon, Dale Earnhardt Jr., and Casey Kane. They also build motors for Tony Stewart, Ryan Newman, and Kurt Busch. It's a fascinating study with Andrew Ossowski, Canucks and Cup, Part 1 on Raceline Radio. 116 employees in the engine shop, is that about right?
Yes, that's about right.
Well, yeah, I guess some fans will say, wow, that's a lot of people, but when you think about it, right, it's the heart of a winning team other than the driver, isn't it? I mean, without engines that have enough power, or certainly engines that don't go the distance, you're pretty much not going anywhere, are you?
Yeah, and the numbers really, how would I put it? The numbers really come back to the amount we do. You have to look at different areas. Of course, there's horsepower and reliability, but
right.
To build the amount of engines we do, you need a lot of people, and we build a lot of motors.
And that's quality control, making sure the parts going into those motors are okay, because, you hear, somebody may have gotten a bad batch of valves or springs or something. I mean, it's all quality controlled. It's very highly controlled right down the line, isn't it?
It is. Everything you do, we've got procedures and standards for everything, and from how a crankshaft is manufactured and its heat treat right down to the type of lube you put on the bolt
right
on the motor.
Yeah.
Okay? And that is through and through the whole engine. You try to build it where we have 13 guys assembling engines. We're 13 people, and they have to be built the same.
Yeah.
Right down the line. Because of exactly what you mentioned earlier, batch issues, things like this, you want everybody to be common, so when a problem does happen, you can eliminate, let's say, the assembly part of it, then you fall back onto the materials or the heat treat or the manufacturing process,
right.
Things like that.
Yeah. Andrew Ossowski from Brigham, Quebec is our Canuck in Cup and our feature here on Raceline Radio, an assembler with Hendrick Motorsports in the engine department. Andrew, you started in high school and I guess pretty much self-taught, but you did some work with the old NASCAR North Tour, so did you ever cross bumpers with people like Jean-Paul Cabana and that like? Or?
Well, that's who I used to work with.
Oh, perfect.
I started going to races in '79.
Right.
That was pretty well my first, I was only 16 at that point, just getting going. And from basically 1980 right up to 80, season of 84 was my last year. Then in 85 I went IndyCar racing.
Right.
And spent a year IndyCar racing with Hall of Famer David Billis.
Right on.
I'm sure you know the name.
Yes, I certainly do.
And spent a year there, running around the country, learning a craft, and trying to.
Yep.
It was a fun time. It was a great time to learn and to experience new things.
The IndyCar thing is one thing, and of course we follow that very closely here on Raceline because of the two races in the country and the number of Canadian drivers and teams that are around, at least people involved in those teams. Was it always sort of stock cars for you and not IndyCars? Did you always seem to have that pull to get back to that, or was it just the way the cards fell?
No, well. You're right. I mean, stock cars is really what I've always done. Okay,
yeah.
Have fenders on it. I've always liked that more. I can remember I remember when I was a kid just watching some of the races that they would run on TV, because in the earlier years you never saw live broadcasts, obviously.
That's right.
I was always amazed by NASCAR. That's what it was. When the IndyCar deal came along, that was like, hey, it's a job. I want to learn. It's racing, right?
Right.
And I really appreciate it, and I would have liked to have kept on. But unfortunately, in those days, when the job was done, team was done, I moved back home. Yeah,
and you gotta go where the work is. And you followed your brother to Hendrick in 2000, and the mentorship of the legendary Randy Dorton, who was killed in that terrible plane crash in October of '04. Andrew, Randy was the one engine builder I think that most knew was out there. I mean, the tip of your tongue, do you talk about an engine builder or an engine guy? But Dorton was one of those guys, and the first to use, as you kind of touched on there, the cause and effect approach to building engines and diagnosing problems with them. Explain that when something goes wrong, you can trace it back pretty quick.
Well, it's very easy to presume what happens when you have a part failure.
Sure, yeah.
It's very easy to say, well, that's just that company's fault, or this company's fault, or that assembler's fault. But when you really get down to it, probably 99% of the failures are all they're not human related. It is a component that could have a defect in it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Yep.
And I'm not knocking manufacturers by any means, but
not at all. No.
the reality of it,
Sure.
So his way of looking at it was going beyond the human side of it. Okay, let's dig deeper into the mechanical side of it. Look at things that you normally wouldn't look at. Look at it a little deeper. If you're talking about steels and materials, look at the material itself. Does it fit the specifications of what the manufacturer says? Then look at the heat treat that is in it. Does that fit the specifications? And when you start looking deeper and deeper, all of a sudden it opens up a whole new area that you go like, wow, I never realized that before.
Well, it's obvious, though, Andrew, the system works because, you're taking basically a 355 cubic inch small block push rod V8 motor, you're winding it up to 9,000 RPM and even higher in bits, running that thing close to wide open for 3 to 4 hours in punishing heat. And, you rarely see guys blow these things up. They might be simple compared, to an Indy car or even an F1 engine, but they really are a feat of engineering, aren't they? Every single one of them.
Yeah, to imagine, in 2004 when we were turning them over 10,000 RPM, if anybody had ever thought that, even 2 years earlier than that, you'd go like, you're nuts, right?
Exactly. Interesting. We lined up this interview. There's part one. A week before Hendrick was hit with those engine bugs at Michigan. That happens, but it's how you root out those bugs and recover that's the key. And Andrew Ossowski there details us more of that in part two of our Canucks in Cup special. Their motors were fine at Bristol. But we do the pit stop right here, then open the email bag for your entries in our TSO Raceline contest. Hang with us a while longer, won't you? This is the Raceline Radio Network.
This is Rubens Barrichello, and you are listening to Raceline Radio.
Back on Raceline Radio.
It's Raceline on the Raceline Radio Network. Onward, this guest segment brought to you by WD-40, our Raceline WD-40 tip of the week. A squirt will drive moisture off your spark plug wires and ignition. WD-40. Problem solved, job done right. Ready for part two. Here we go with our Canucks and Cup feature interview, a long-running Raceline Radio feature where we chat with Canadians who have uprooted themselves to move south to work in the NASCAR Sprint Cup Series with skills and specialties other than driving the car. In this installment, we're meeting Brigham, Quebec native Andrew Ossowski, who moved down to work in the engine shop at Hendrick Motorsports 12 years ago, building motors for Jimmy Johnson during his 5-season championship run and won for the 4 Jeff Gordon titles. He helps put together motors for Hendrick's 4 drivers and customers, Tony Stewart, Ryan Newman, and Kurt Busch in the bargain. We know about some rare engine breakage they just had at Michigan, but it's now how you troubleshoot and recover like they did at Bristol that keeps these guys at the top of the sport. Here's part two of our interview with Andrew Ossowski on Raceline Radio.
Coming back again to the things that have changed over time, steels, materials, heat treatments have evolved so much in the last 10 years. That is what allowed us to push those limits to higher and higher all the time.
Right.
What worked in 1990 is ancient history now, obviously, but because of what has been developed on the engineering side, on the materials, it allows us to do what we do, right? And so if you can turn it 9,400, well, your goal is now 9,600, right? So what do you have to do to get there?
Yeah.
What is the weakest link in that whole chain?
Yeah, and make sure the components don't fail and keep it all together, which,
and there's so much on the line with sponsorship. Failure is, pardon the pun, but failure is really not an option.
Exactly.
Because of the national exposure you get, you don't want to have that happen to you, right? So we go to great pains to make sure that when the components are delivered to, let's say, to us on the assembly side, they've gone through the CMM process, which is coordinates measuring machines, which is precise down to the 100,000th of an inch.
Wow.
And things like that, okay? And you have to have those reports. We have to go through those reports to make sure that the components we're getting are right to go in the motor. Andrew
Ossowski from Brigham, Quebec, is an assembler with the Hendrick Motorsports team in the engine department. I'm intrigued, too, by this off-the-rack system. You don't build for specific teams. What team gets what engine is up to the management. You guys find out later if your, in quotations, engine was the one that carried Jimmy, Jeff, Casey, or Junior to or a customer, for that matter, to victory lane. That's kind of an interesting system, right?
Yeah, they instituted that because in 2000, and that's about around 2001, they really changed how the business model had to change.
Mm-hmm.
And you had individual builders doing their own deal for Jeff Gordon, an individual builder doing his deal for Terry Labonte.
Yeah.
But business was changing, and we talked earlier about sponsorships, money, failures. You can't have these. Randy was really instrumental in bringing that all together, saying, okay, we're not going to do that anymore. Now everybody's going to run the same pistons. Everybody's going to run the same camshafts.
Right on, yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
And in doing that, we created how to put it, it was fairer, first off.
Yeah.
On a business side, I think to incorporate things together. You can't have people running off in 4 different directions.
No.
Okay?
That wouldn't
we have
work,
a great engineering staff here that is works very painstakingly at making sure that things are right, but you have to be going down that same road all the time. And this is what Randy really instituted. It's like, okay, individual builders are out. Now everybody builds. You build to the same sheet,
Yep.
same specs.
Yep.
Once the engine's dynoed, management then looks at dyno numbers. They look at cycle numbers, which would be we have 36 components in an engine that we measure cycles, which is one cycle is one revolution.
Right.
Okay. So we look at those components and how many cycles they have on them, and based on the numbers they see for dyno numbers and the cycles they see, they will pass out the engines based on that. Typically, if you're highest in points, it's where that will be the guy who's going to get the highest horsepower engine.
I got you.
Okay.
Right.
But now there's exceptions to that. Let's say you're 4 races from the chase, which we're getting close to right now.
Exactly
okay?
right now, yep.
Dale Jr. is very safe in points, in theory, okay?
Yep. Yeah.
So
yep.
he might not necessarily get the best engine. You might give that one to Jeff because Jeff's fighting to get in the chase.
Exactly,
So you
yeah.
get that extra 1 or 2 horsepower.
Sure.
So that's how the management looks at it.
Yeah, and it's the team concept, but it's got to be done in a proper balance. For those who don't think that car makers are using and testing and developing with racing as a platform, they should know that you work directly with General Motors engineering staff on the development of the R07 engine, and that's the kind of challenge I know that you enjoy doing.
Yeah, it was, again, working with the Chevrolet engineering, it was, again, a very eye-opening experience on how far you can push yourself. You don't really realize what you can do until you're surrounded by people that are better than you. You
Yeah.
feed off them.
Sure.
It's like, wow, okay. And to me, it was a great. I'm pretty proud of the fact that I was there in the beginning of the R07 development.
Absolutely.
I've worked with them. I'm proud of that. That's a personal thing, you know.
You should be proud of that. No, absolutely. And then you did most of the work on the team's electronic fuel injection system that replaced the carburetors this year, and that seems to have gone in. I'm not going to say seamlessly, Andrew, but I mean, with a throttle body and smooth throttle response, so there's no complaint from the driver. Everybody pretty happy with how the EFI is working now, Andrew?
It is. It's. I would say the first 10 races of the year were definitely challenging. Ultimately, you want reliability as the first thing, right? If it's not quite drivable the way you want it, that's one thing. You can still finish your race, but by God, if it breaks down, that's a bad thing.
You're done.
So,
that's right.
you have so many sensors, so many wires now that you have to make sure are going to make it through the race. That was the number one priority. And then as, obviously, your weeks go on, you're always tweaking based on the driver's comments after their post-race comments and the meetings they have during the week. Then you work on tweaking it to try to make it where it's to what he needs to do his job. Not easy.
No, not easy at all. Andrew Ossowski from Brigham, Quebec is our Canucks in Cup feature interview on Raceline Radio. You don't just rely, though, on the dyno, and you mentioned that word. I know you and the team think it's very important to get out to the racetrack with this stuff, Andrew. You've got to run and test the gear on the battlefield proper, don't you?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. And we've talked about that within the shop here, how we can do endurance runs on an engine. We can put 500-600 miles on a motor on the dyno.
Yep.
Do that every week here, okay? But that is not the real world. Is underhood temperatures, vibrations, things like that, right?
Yep.
So you go to different racetracks that we don't race at, and you will do that mileage earlier in the year to try to just simulate as much as you can. Beat it as hard as you can.
Right.
if you can make it fail there, it was probably going to fail at the racetrack.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah. Young fans listening to this, Andrew, you might not be able to drive, but if you go to school, get your ticket, and have a willingness to move south and learn, you can get involved in racing this way too, can't you? I mean, are teams looking for new talent in this area, and mechanics and people to do engines, other than the drivers you hear about? Drivers trying to get work, but there is work for mechanics if you're lucky to drop into it like you did.
Yeah, there is. In the last 6-7 years, I probably came into this business on the tail end of what would be the older style of doing things.
Okay.
Where you're an engine builder, you're a machinist, you're a mechanic. Now, it is very engineering driven.
Right on.
Very engineering driven, and the best thing I can say is if anybody wants to get into this business, you have to almost have a mechanical engineering degree to even be able to get in the door. It's a fact.
Well, no, that's a fact.
And that's what they're looking for. That doesn't replace common sense people, but that's the way it's being driven now. And what do? When you're looking for very small gains in a race car, whether it be in an engine, a chassis, or anywhere, you have to have very smart people to be able to detect those things. And that's what engineers do.
Yeah, that's what they do. Andrew, yours is a fascinating story. Thank you for spending some time with us on our Canucks and Cup feature on Raceline Radio. Best of luck to you and the entire Hendrick organization as we get closer to that chase for the championship. Andrew, this has been great. Thank you so much for your time.
It was my pleasure.
Well, simply without engine builders like Canadian Andrew Ossowski there, his skill, his talent, the cars and drivers in the NASCAR Sprint Cup Series don't make it to the finish line. They don't win races and they don't win championships. And it's that simple. Engine failures in the series are rare because of guys like Andrew and guys who aren't even with us anymore, like Randy Dorton in the Hendrick shop. A pleasure to spend those few minutes with that guy, and timely, too, with some of those rare engine woofs at Michigan and how they prevent it from happening again. All part of the game, is it not? I do love the technical stuff, and I think you do, too, because I've always believed this, that you need to have a basic working knowledge of those things to understand why some drivers and teams win races and others do not. If you understand how the engines work, how the aerodynamics work, how all of that stuff works together, either in the engine shop or on the dyno or at the racetrack, you really understand why some are successful and others just try to get there. Our Canucks and Cup feature on Raceline Radio. More installments coming in the weeks to come. All right, Alyssa, let's set the stuff out for the final. I'll be all right. The final pit stop. Then we set up next week's show and more, and we'll do that for you on the last lap. A few more bits to do, so come on back. This is the Raceline Radio Network.
Hi, this is Rusty Wallace. Raceline Radio returns in a moment.